Hello there, art nerds, and happy Halloween! To celebrate this year, I'm going to walk you through my process for creating this very cute berry witch watercolor illustration. I'm working on the Mairtini round block. I would recommend, if you're working along with me, that you use a cotton rag block if possible. If you're one of my amazing art nerds over on Patreon, I have a printable line art that you can color however you wish, but I am also going to demonstrate in this tutorial how to do a graphite transfer. So grab your paints, grab your brushes, and let's get painting. Starting with a blue line printout of the image that I want to transfer. It doesn't have to be blue line, it could be any color so long as it's light enough for you to see the graphite. I have cut a series of radiating strips around it. This is going to make it a little bit easier to wrap it around my round block. And then I'm covering the back with a soft 6B graphite. I'm going to have all the materials down in the description below for you guys. Now, to make sure I can get a good transfer, I tape down the back and then I use a mechanical pencil and press down really hard to transfer that graphite onto our watercolor paper. Now, this isn't a perfect transfer, so I'm going to go back in with a pencil and just kind of clean up some areas, but I am going to ink this illustration as well, so it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough for me to work from. If you're interested in seeing more of my art and you like this illustration, make sure you follow me on my other social media sites. I'm always sharing new art to Twitter, to TikTok, and to Instagram. So once we finish kind of cleaning up the art and getting ready for our inking, I will share some of my socials with you guys, and hopefully you guys will follow me and check out what I've been working on. I have reviewed a lot of watercolor papers and watercolor supplies here on the channel over the years, so if you're looking for some suggestions, I've definitely got you covered with some great reviews that will help you buy materials that should hopefully make watercolor easier for you. I've also got some great, easy to follow along with, easy to paint tutorials, so if you're just watching this one for enjoyment and company, hi, hello, welcome. I'm so glad to hang out with you on Halloween this year. But if you're interested in starting your own watercolor journey, I've got you covered, so check the description below for recommendations. Now that we've got everything all cleaned up, it's time to ink. So I'm going to be inking today with the Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. I happen to really like brush pens. I find them very comfortable to ink with, and I love that they can give me a variety of line weights, but I recommend you use what you're comfortable with inking with. If it's tech pens, go for tech pens. If it's dip pen, good on you. If you like to ink with a brush, go for that as well. But since we're doing watercolor today, it does need to be a waterproof ink. And that's one of the reasons I really like the Sakura Pigma FB. Not only is it waterproof, but it's also alcohol marker safe. So it can take basically whatever I throw at it. So this video has been time-lapsed to varying degrees, and many of the segments have been time-lapse 8x, but some of the ones where I really want you guys to be able to see what I'm doing have been time-lapse 2x or 4x. So I'm pointing this out because I want to help dispel the notion that art is fast. Art takes time, and it took a couple of hours for me to ink this piece, and I ink fairly fast, and I wasn't doing anything particularly complicated with this illustration. It's also a smaller illustration, so comparatively, it really did not take that long to ink. But my recommendation for inking is put on some relaxing music or put on a movie that you've seen a few times, just something that'll kind of be on in the background to kind of keep part of your brain occupied, and just enjoy the process. Don't feel like you have to rush through it or hurry it up. Take your time and make sure you're happy with it. Now, one of the things that I do, and one of the things that I've had to get good at, is inking without making mistakes or learning how to cover my mistakes, because if I added a correctional fluid, whiteout, if I use white gouache at this point, it would be incredibly noticeable where I made the mistake once I paint it. So I save those kind of corrections if necessary for the very end. And if you can, I would recommend that you do the same. Now, it takes years of practice to get pretty good. I would say I'm pretty good at inking. Not the best, not the worst, fairly competent. That MFA in comics is put to good use when it comes to inking things, and I sure do ink a lot. But it does take some practice, so don't feel bad if it takes you a little bit longer to get what you want out of it, or if you have to work harder to get at what you want out of it. There's a story about an emperor hired an artist to paint a rooster for him, and this artist took multiple years to figure out how to paint roosters and practice painting roosters. And then he comes to the palace and he's able to paint a rooster for the emperor in 5 minutes. And the emperor wants to know what took him so long. Why, if it only took you 5 minutes to paint this rooster, why did you need all these years? And the artist replied that it took all those years of practice to learn how to paint a rooster in 5 minutes. So what I'm saying with that is all the work you put in, all the practicing you do, all the art you have done up to this point has made you into the artist you are today, has given you the skills that you have and the confidence that you have. And if you're not where you want to be just yet, the more you practice, the more you make art, the more you make mistakes and you learn from those mistakes, the better an artist you'll be in the future and the more confident you'll be as an artist. My art is not the best, it's not the flashiest, it's not the showiest, but I trained for years as a convention artist who did quick fire commissions with people literally watching me as I drew their commission and sometimes nagging me to draw even faster than I was already drawing. So I have a very specific skill set that enables me to comfortably and confidently draw when it's not like a quick fire challenge under a minute, to confidently and competently draw for groups of people, including my students. And I would not be at that place if it hadn't been for a decade of doing convention commissions with impatient customers egging me on to finish even faster. So all of your experiences can be used to help you become a better artist and to help you pursue the kind of art or the kind of art career that you want to have. Before I get too long-winded, what I'm saying about this is years of inking comics, both before grad school and during grad school, years of inking convention commissions, because my inked commissions ended up being kind of like the only commission I made any kind of a profit on, because I could do them quick enough and with enough pizzazz, and I could charge enough that they were the only ones that were really worth it monetarily. So they were the ones I tended to really talk about and really promote. And doing YouTube videos here on YouTube I started in 2015 and it is 2022. So 7 years of YouTube, and then years of teaching in person, but also years of doing my inked Lilliputian Living Challenge, which I can't make corrections on that either. That's part of the challenge, and it's about not overworking your work and just getting things done and learning to accept that good enough is good enough and finished is better than perfect. All of that and all the mistakes that I made all along the way have helped me become a more confident inker and have allowed me to ink as quickly as I'm able to ink with a brush pen. So I say this as encouragement to you. If you're watching and you're like, oh man, I don't ink fast. First off, this has been time-lapsed by 8, so I don't ink this fast either, but also just years of practice and making mistakes and learning how to hide my mistakes and being very familiar with the materials that I'm using have allowed me to get to this point, and I definitely believe that you can get to this point and far surpass me, especially if you're younger and you're starting your art journey younger. You have so much more time and so many more resources. So please do not compare yourself to other artists and don't let yourself get discouraged on your artistic journey. So after I finish inking this piece, I would normally allow it to dry, to cure to the paper for 24 hours. That's going to prevent any ghosting when I erase the pencil from underneath the line art. However, I had a series of unfortunate events happen to me in September and October, and I wasn't able to pick this piece up for a whole month from when I inked it. So those inks had plenty of time to cure to the paper. But if you are playing along at home with me, I do recommend at least 24 hours before you erase it. And I'm going to use a soft white vinyl eraser to erase the graphite from underneath my inks. And what that does is it doesn't lift the ink off the paper as much as, say, like a pink pearl eraser or an art gum eraser might do. It just gently lifts the graphite without, disturbing the ink too much. For inks like this, they might look complicated, but it's a lot of the same sort of imagery repeated and overlapped and rescaled. So my tip for inking is to just take your time, work from front to back, and if there's something that is of visual interest or very important, like the most important thing on the page, so her face would be a good example of that, because if we make mistakes on the face, people are definitely going to notice. I would do that first, or I would do that early on right after warming up. And that way you're going to be able to give it your best inking. You're going to be the least likely to make mistakes because you're tired or you're bored of inking the same things over and over again, or you're in a hurry. And it's easier to hide mistakes with, say, the blackberries, or it's easier for things to be a little wabi-sabi and less perfect because these are a more organic form, and we expect to see those kind of imperfections in, say, berries than we would want to see in an inked face. So I would recommend inking the important things earlier on and then working from front to back. So inking the things that overlap the other things first. So here are my finished, cleaned up inks. The pencil has been erased and I scanned it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a toning wash. It is a little bit of ultramarine blue mixed with some cerulean blue, and this is going to be kind of not just our sky in the background, but it's also going to give kind of an atmospheric feel to this illustration. I am also lifting out, using a clean paper towel, her face and the flower so that those don't get too dark and so that they don't get too muddy as we layer on the color. colors. And I ended up doing several layers of this blue and then blending it out. I'm using water on a clean brush. I'm painting it on top of her skin, and that's going to allow me to lift some of that color back out just a little bit. So the Mairtini paper that we're working on today is a mixed fiber watercolor paper, and it's a little bit more challenging to paint on. So I would recommend you either work on a full cellulose paper or you work on a full cotton rag paper, because I've noticed that full fiber papers, regardless of the fiber, do tend to handle a little bit better than these mixed fiber papers. However, I bought this block and I'm going to use this block, so that's why I'm being a little bit stubborn about it. Right now, I am doing a bit of a Grisaille underpainting. I am toning my painting with a mixture of indigo. I think it's Marmary blue. I forget what blue it is specifically, but it's kind of like a cool purpley blue, if that makes sense. The specifics are not that important. We all are painting with different watercolors. I just wanted to give you guys kind of a vibe of the colors that I'm using, and also a little bit of neutral tint. And what I'm doing is I'm kind of creating an underpainting. So we're knocking in our values before we even start thinking about our color. And if you're someone who struggles with lighting or with creating enough contrast, this sort of underpainting is a great way to help you start thinking about your light source and your shadows and your overlap, to start thinking about your atmospheric perspective before you even start worrying about your color. And I'll usually do this over a few layers just to kind of really build this up. And I find that this technique is so helpful for darker illustrations, like illustrations that might take place in a darker room, nighttime illustrations, illustrations that take place with a lot of greenery or foliage, because it kind of creates a cohesive underpalette that ties our colors together. If you're looking to learn more about atmospheric perspective, I've got some great tutorials for you guys, as I mentioned earlier. I'll link them down in the description below, so make sure you check that description. I always put a lot of time into selecting other related playlists and videos that I think you guys might find helpful, useful, and informative. So it really means a lot to me when you do check the description. I will also have the majority of the materials that I talk about in this tutorial linked as well. So if you're looking to do a little bit of shopping, if you use my Amazon affiliate links, I see a little bit of money from that. You guys don't pay any extra, and it's a great way to help the channel just a little bit without spending any extra money. So I've mixed the solution a little bit thicker, a little more saturated, and I am going in and kind of refining those shadows, darkening some areas, and blocking things in. And hopefully you guys can start to see this come together and it's starting to make sense. This is a technique I use all the time. I really like this technique. It is so helpful. It has really helped me improve my art and improve my storytelling within my art. And while it doesn't work on all papers, like the paper that I paint 7-inch Cara, my watercolor comic on, is not as receptive to as this much work as, say, a full cotton rag paper would be, it's still a really helpful technique, especially when you want to capture the scene or set the mood. Speaking of setting the mood, I am dabbing in some loose, very wet areas of blue and then spritzing it with clean water to get it to kind of diffuse. Then I splatter some of that blue in as well. I let it dry a little bit and splatter it again. And this is just going to help break up some of those forms. Next, I'm using a really light wash of a warmer yellow and adding it to her to kind of help her pop from the background and make her look like she's a little bit sunlit. So even though the general tone of this piece would be, theoretically, you would think it would be very happy, very warm, very nurturing. A little tiny witch is going out to pick blackberries. I wanted to also convey a little bit of spooky, a little sense of danger. That's why she's looking behind her and very surprised, kind of startled, like what is lurking in those brambles behind her. That dried, it gave me a chance to kind of reevaluate things. So I'm going back in with more of that yellow and blending it out just a little bit. I'm also adding it to some of the leaves to make them feel like they're closer to the viewer and to make them pop a little bit. And I'm blending that out with just some clean water. Trick I have to help me not confuse myself is I'm going to go ahead and block in our darker areas of the foliage. And I'm using some indigo mixed with that darker marmory blue that we talked about. And I'm starting with the furthest background foliage that would be in silhouette, but I'm also going to work this in the bottom foliage that's furthest away from our little witch to create kind of a sense of depth. Now to blend that in just a little bit so everything isn't so straightforward and so neat and tidy, I'm going to add some more blue around the exterior of the illustration, as you guys will see in just a minute. I'm going to do it pretty loosely, and then I'm going to spritz it with clean water to encourage it to diffuse. And this is a technique that it's just fun. It adds a little bit of chaos. It kind of breaks up the monotony of a piece, and I feel like it adds some liveliness and some hand of the artist to it. Now on a full cotton rag paper, it should be able to take all these layers without a problem and without getting muddy. The Mairtini paper that I'm using today has this, let's say, interesting property where it's very prone to lifting and to reactivation, and I'm really trying to use that to my advantage with this illustration. I haven't entirely decided on a color palette for this illustration, so I decided to work with what I do know. So we're going to start by blocking in the blackberries. And whenever I think about blackberries, I really think about the juice of the blackberry, which is kind of this like rich reddish color. So I'm going to use that as the undercolor for all of our blackberries, even the ones that are fully ripened and are darker. And for this illustration, I am primarily using silver black velvet watercolor brushes. These are a mixed fiber watercolor brush that are partially squirrel and partially synthetic, and I find that they have the best properties of both, and I highly recommend them. They're a little bit cheaper than full natural fiber brushes, especially with the larger sizes, but my cat is not as tempted to chew on them as he would be with my full squirrel hair brushes. So I recommend these. I really like them. It's hard to find them individually on Amazon. Usually I purchase them in person at my local brick and mortar as I need different and newer brushes, but you can also find them individually on Dick Blick. And I do think Amazon has gotten somewhat better about offering the smaller sets. I'm primarily working with round watercolor brushes today, and that's just because they're great all-rounders. They can paint a variety of subjects, and as a comic artist, I need to be able to paint just about everything. So I like brushes that allow me to do just that. Once my berries have mostly dried, I'm going in with a darker variation of the color. So it's a mix of naphthalide maroon with some alizarin crimson, and I may start dipping in some purple. So if you watch really carefully, I'm actually working with 3 brushes. I've got the brush that has the naphthalide maroon with alizarin crimson. I've got a brush of clean water that I'm using to blend that out. And then I have a brush with naphthalide maroon mixed with purple so that we can start getting those darker tints. And on a higher quality paper, we would get this lovely diffused wet into wet that's a little more subtle. But on this mixed fiber paper, unfortunately, the color just kind of rushes to fill the whole area. So you don't get that beautiful wet into wet the way you would on a full cotton rag paper. But this is me using my stash. I know this paper has problems. I'm just sharing this information with you guys because if you're painting along, you may want to make different choices based on the information that I'm sharing with you guys. For the larger blackberries, I have a stronger mix of naphthalide maroon and violet, or rather purple, leaning more towards the dioxine purple because I don't want these to be actually black. I want them to be just like a really, really dark bluish purple. I want them to feel kind of rich. Right now, the berries are looking a little too straightforward, a little too dark and kind of stagnant. So once I finish kind of painting in my berries, I'm going to take my spritzer bottle with clean water and give them some sprays and really encourage that color to move and to migrate to other areas. And that's going to influence the color around it. And in my opinion, it ends up creating a more lively piece. At this point, once it's had a chance to kind of dry, it might not be 100% fully dry, but it's mostly dry. I am dabbing in some stronger dioxine purple mixed with either neutral tint or Payne's gray, so a darker, cooler color. And I'm just dabbing it in and allowing it to kind of diffuse out into the berries. I'm also using my clean paper towel to lift out some areas that feel like they may have gotten too dark. This is going to give us something that we can apply our masking fluid to, and it's going to allow us to reserve some highlights. I allowed the piece to dry fully, and I'm using Winsor & Newton's removable tinted masking fluid. And what I like about this is it doesn't tear up my paper when I remove it, and I can see it when I put it on the paper. I am using a synthetic watercolor brush. It's a cheap one. It's a Princeton Snap, and I've mixed some brush soap into it. If you don't have brush soap, you can use just bar soap. And what that does is it protects the brush. It keeps the bristles from soaking up that masking fluid into the ferrule and ruining the brush. So that is a really helpful trick. I would also recommend you don't use masking fluid with the brushes that you really like. Use them with the cheaper brushes. So I applied just some dots of masking fluid to my berries. I also did some splatter technique. I allowed that to dry. I painted another layer on top of it, and now I'm repeating the same process. And when you're working with masking fluid, it is really, really important that you work on dry paper and that you allow the masking fluid to dry completely before you try painting over it. Because when I've had problems with masking fluid tearing my paper, it's because I was impatient and I tried to get back to work on it too quickly. So I'm adding another layer of our alizarin crimson, probably mixed with some naphthalene maroon. Oh, sorry, my brain wants to go faster than my mouth can, and then I start to jumble words. So if you guys ever hear me like slow it down and repeat myself, it's because I started to get kind of tongue-tied, and I want you guys to understand what I'm talking about because I know I talk fast. I'm trying to keep up with the time lapse, but I also just talk fast naturally. So I've applied some of that cooler red to kind of start building up that beautiful sort of berry color. And then I'm going back in with a mix of our dioxine purple with either some indigo or some Payne's gray mixed into it. Basically a cooler color to give us that really dark and delicious berry sort of color that we're using for the blackberries here. Now, one thing I noticed that you might want to avoid is I just kind of spent a lot of time doing the same thing over and over again when it comes to these berries. And it's because I had very little time to really just sit down and work on this piece. So I kept putting it aside and coming back to it over the course of several days. And that's when I have a tendency to really overwork things. So if you're able to just sit down and do, hopefully you won't overwork it quite as much as I have. You don't have to do this many layers. It's not necessary. So once that's dried, I'm going to start working on the leaves. And I also want to point out that I am working using reference. So this isn't meant to be photorealistic. That's not my attempt. I'm a cartoony illustrator. But I do have images of blackberry brambles, not the drink, the actual brambles, pulled up on my screen, and I'm using that to get color ideas and lighting ideas and just general ways of how I want to handle this. So one of the ways I really like to paint foliage is I like to use a lot of optical mixing. So I allow the colors to kind of mix in your eyes. So I'm painting an underlayer of a cooler bismuth yellow, and that's going to make some of these leaves pop. I'm not going to do all the leaves like this. I really just want to make the ones that are going to be closer to the viewer pop. And while some of those are still wet, I'm going in with just a little bit more of that yellow in a thicker saturation, dabbing it in, and then blending it out just a little bit. So I'm using the two brush method. One of them has a thinner mix of the color, and one of them has the more saturated mix. And I'm keeping the more saturated color towards the edges of the leaves, like the sun is hitting that first. Not shown for some strange reason, I did a really light wash of Hooker's green on all of the leaves, allowed it to dry, and now I'm going in and using some masking fluid to mask off sort of like a dewdrop effect. So very simple, just dotting in those dewdrops, and I'm going to allow them to dry fully before we start painting again. Now that my masking fluid has dried, I'm going in with a thicker mix of our Hooker's green, and I'm blending it out as it reaches the edges of some of the leaves with some clean water. And I'm just gonna go kind of leaf set by leaf set and make my way around the rondel. If possible, I highly encourage you to move your painting around to the angle that is easiest for you and your wrist to accomplish. So you guys see me moving this round around so that I can more easily paint some of the leaves from an angle that's more natural and more comfortable for me. You should be doing that too. The only reason I and many other YouTube artists don't do it more is the constraints of filming. I may be working on a piece that's a little bit too large to easily rotate on camera, or it may be just too nauseating, too much motion sickness to watch. But if you're painting at home, move that canvas to the angle that is easiest for you to work with. I'm going to spritz that with water again, encourage some movement, encourage some liveliness, and you guys can see it starts to bleed out into other things. I want that. What I don't want is my hair and nose getting into the camera. I apologize for that. So now that I've kind of started painting in the background, I'm going to start actually working on our little witch here. So I have mixed a light skin tone. It is yellow ochre with a little bit of scarlet red, and I'm just building that up gently over layers, letting it dry, and then going back into it, sometimes mixing it a little bit more saturated so that I can get those shadows in there. And this is kind of our under layer for the skin. I'm also dabbing in a little bit of alizarin crimson on the cheeks, above the eyes, under the nose, on the lips, on the fingertips, etc., just to kind of give some blood flow and some liveliness. It makes it look like she's been running through these brambles. Blend that out a little bit, and then I'm going to use a little bit of a reddish purple mix, so naphthalene maroon mixed with a little bit of mauve, in order to create the skin tone shadow. And that is usually what I use when a warmer object is kind of blocking the natural light on top of skin, or skin covering up skin, if that makes sense. So really looking back on it, I should have leaned into the Little Red Riding Hood vibes and gone with really warm red colors for this, or reds and browns. But I decided to go with purples, kind of echoing in those blackberries. So I pulled out my secondary palette. I call it my Naomi palette because it's colors that my character Naomi typically wears in the comics. So since they're more unusual colors that require a little bit of special handling, there's more opaques in there, there's more neons in there, I kind of keep them in their own palette. I pulled it out because there are some reddish purples that I really like that I wanted to use for this. And I'm also going to use ultramarine violet for her skirt. I was really hoping to get some of that beautiful granulation that ultramarine violet is capable of. It just did not work so well for this one. I'm going back in as well and using purple mixed with indigo to paint in darker shadows on the clothing and kind of pre-establish that, because once I start adding in the layers, it's going to be more challenging to kind of glaze those darker shadow colors on top of it and still have it have an effect. So just to be a little harsh on myself, I don't love the colors I picked for her outfit. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about them. I would probably choose different colors, or maybe even do like a tartan plaid on her shawl. But it is what it is, and finished is better than perfect. And this piece is finished. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going back and kind of lamenting that. I just wanted to point that out to you guys because I'm not going to actually spend a lot of time talking about the colors that I chose for her outfit because I'm not really happy about them. One of the things though is that even if I don't like the colors that I chose, I was trying to maintain that lighting and trying to maintain that sense of drama. I probably should have gone a little bit further with the contrast between the lightest values and the darkest values in her clothing. And that's something I tried to remedy when I went into the color pen or the watercolor pencil stage. But you know, that's the beautiful thing about these time-lapse tutorials is they provide me an opportunity to look back at my art and to think about what I would do differently and how I would handle the pieces differently and try to learn from that. So even if I end up not liking how I handle something, I try to use it as an opportunity to learn and grow. And mostly I'm just happy that the thing is finished. At this point, I not only felt like there wasn't enough drama going on in this illustration, I felt like everything was a little bit too light, but I also felt like the colors weren't influencing one another as much as I really wanted them to. So I'm going in with some indigo and just kind of slathering it loosely on top of everything, really roughly just blocking in some of those shadows. And what this does is it loosens everything up and it adds a lot of drama. I'm also spritzing it with some water to kind of get those colors to move. Now, it probably looks like I ruined the piece, but fear not. On this paper, the colors dry a lot lighter than they go down. So it looks really dark now, but it's going to lighten up. This also gives me the opportunity to add in some additional contrast and some additional drama when I pull out my watercolor pencils. I can also use a dry paper towel to lift some areas back up just a little bit. And I'm going to continue to work and add in some randomness and some drama by using splatter techniques into the foliage, as well as a little bit of our warmer yellow. This is going to give it kind of a sun dappled effect because I don't want this to be like total nightmare. She's running from something, but by lightening things up, it kind of gives the impression that all hope isn't lost. She's entering into a clearing and she's going to be safe soon. I'm also using that yellow on some of the leaves to just kind of lighten them up and brighten them up, and I'll continue working on that a little bit further in. I'm also going to darken her clothes and just kind of tweak and adjust the colors because we blocked in the colors and we have kind of a good idea of what those colors are going to look like, and this gives me a chance to kind of continue to work with them and to adjust them a little bit. So something that some people think, people who are not that familiar with watercolor, or maybe have used the wrong watercolors or on the wrong paper, or maybe their teacher just wasn't that helpful, something that some people think about watercolor is once it's on the paper, that's it, it's done, game over. And while traditional media is not quite as forgiving as digital media, we don't have infinite undos. Watercolor is very forgiving. It can be lifted, it can be reworked, you can add another color on top of it, and the translucency will work together to create a secondary color. There's a lot you can do with watercolor, especially if you're not trying to adhere to strict school of watercolor rules where you can't introduce gouache and you can't introduce inks and you can't introduce watercolor pencils. I say that's all hooey. I'm a comic artist and an illustrator. I use the tools I need to use to get the job done to make the art I like. And if you like the art that I've made, that's good enough for me. I'm not trying to impress people who sometimes just don't want to be impressed. I'm trying to make art that will make you smile, or will make you happy, or will make your day just a little bit brighter. So at this point, I'm going back in with our darker blue color and I'm adding in more shadows, and I'm trying to kind of add in shading and add in delineation and add in contrast so that things are a little bit easier to read visibly. If I were working on a nicer quality paper, this would just add up and result to beautiful art, beautiful layering, beautiful translucency. but we're working on with a mixed fiber paper here, and it can be a little bit temperamental, and the colors do dry a little duller and a little more muddy than they would on a cotton rag paper. I still love how the finished illustration turned out, but again, if you're painting along at home and you have the option to choose a cotton rag paper, I would recommend that you choose a cotton rag paper if you want to use this many techniques, because the resulting art will turn out just a lot nicer, and you won't have to work it as much as I did. Learn from my mistakes, because that is part of tutorials. That's part of learning, is when an artist can share what they would do differently, and you have the benefit of working from that knowledge. But I'm using that darker, more shaded color just to kind of add in some delineation, some shadow, some contrast, and then I speckled in some more blue. So now I'm going to really work on, so I didn't like how like pinky pink her corset and the strap that like loops her skirt up turned out. It was a little too cutesy for me. Not that I don't love cutesy, just not the vibe I was going for here. So I'm adding in more red to kind of mute it down and make it feel a little bit more rich, and so that we get that feeling of drama. So for her hair color, typically I would go really dark. As a brunette myself, I am biased. I've noticed that blondes tend to paint blondes and redheads tend to paint redheads, so I guess we paint mostly what we know. But I'm going for a lighter hair color for this one, just because I do tend to paint a lot of darker haired characters, and I thought this would also give me kind of an opportunity to add in some of that contrast and also give me more range that I could work with. I love painting hair. I'm working with a smaller round for this, and one thing I just cannot stress enough is I heavily encourage you to always work with the largest, the biggest, the chunkiest watercolor brush you're comfortable with using. I see so many artists work with these teeny tiny brushes to cover these huge areas. And while there are some artists who can make beautiful art that way, I find it tends to result in muddier colors, scratchier looking art, and it just takes forever. So I recommend you paint with the largest brush you're comfortable with. Maybe even work a little bit bigger, just a little bit bigger than you're comfortable with, because you'll get used to it. So now I'm working on developing those blackberries. So we're still doing our dioxine purple, maybe some neutral tint, and I'm starting to work in some black as well. And I'm also going back over some of the leaves with our yellow. So this is a semi-opaque cooler yellow, and what is beautiful about that is that you can layer it on top of the other colors and it actually shows up, because that little bit of opacity helps it stand up against those darker colors, and it allows us to build up this color story and to build up this depth of color. So at this point, it's all about just kind of massaging the piece into what I want it to look like, aka overworking it. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I have to have an unbiased third party come in and be like, okay, Becca, you're done. You've done enough with this one. Especially with a piece like this one, where I'd been working on it off and on while working on other projects and doing Lilliputian living throughout the week. I just tend to kind of fall into old habits and overwork it. So having someone else come in and be like, all right, it's time to move on, can be really helpful, especially for a smaller piece like this, because there are always going to be things that you want to tweak, that you want to adjust, that you want to, oh, if I could just get it just this way, if I could just redo it, it would be perfect. That's how you end up never finishing anything. Another tip I have is if you finish a piece and you don't super love how it turned out, put it away, hide it for a couple of weeks. Come back to it and look at it again later. I bet you'll like it a lot better, because we tend to get very caught up with how we see it turning out in our mind. And when it doesn't come out that way, we may feel some disappointment. So I removed the masking fluid, and now I'm going in with watercolor pencils. I've got a few favorites. I will list them out in the description for you guys. I reviewed a bunch of watercolor pencils, so my faves are based on experience, and it seems like I'm really covering a lot of areas, and part of the reason is I want to play with the opacity and the translucency of watercolor pencils. And what I mean by that is when they are dry, like straight from the pencil, they tend to be very opaque. They have good coverage. And then you wet them and blend them down, and they go more translucent. And this can be a good way to add in some of that contrast or to add back in some of that drama that you might have lost earlier. So I use this technique when I've gone a little too dark in some areas. It's really useful for lightening things up and allowing me to kind of rework things. As I'm going, I'm also finding little bits of masking fluid that I didn't quite get the first time. So I've got my little masking fluid frisket, my masking fluid pickup, handy. I got this one from Dollar Tree. I actually really like the Dollar Tree ones for some reason. They just do a really good job of picking up the masking fluid without tearing the paper. And I just dab that onto my masking fluid and it kind of sticks to it and it pulls it up. It makes it very easy. So once I have finished with my watercolor pencils, I've pulled back out my Sakura Pigma FB because I've noticed with inked line arts like this, as we layer our watercolors on top of it and they add a little bit of opacity on top of the line art, things can start to look dull. Things can start to look kind of muddy, and it can be really helpful to just re-ink, even if you're just re-inking the shadows, even if you're just re-inking for contrast and for clarity, and you're not re-inking the whole thing, but just here and there, re-inking it in parts can be really helpful for just kind of adding that pizzazz back. Now, it might seem like extra work because you already inked it once and now you're inking it again. But like I said, you don't have to ink the whole thing, just the areas that would really benefit from re-inking the most. And then finally, honestly, my favorite part, adding white gouache. I don't know if it's because we're basically done and I'm excited that we're basically done, or, and this is what I think it really is, it really starts to come to life when you add the highlights to the hair and you add the shine to the eyes and you add rim lighting to the leaves and you add some highlights to the dewdrops. It just really, it adds that last bit of contrast. It adds that last bit of light and it just makes it feel special and it really kind of pulls the piece together. And I think that's why adding in the gouache is probably my favorite part. Now, if you're not familiar with gouache, gouache is an opaque watercolor medium and you basically want to mix it to the consistency of cream. I'm not really a gouache artist, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but I do like to use it for our final details and our highlights. And here we have our finished Berry Witch illustration. I am so glad that I was able to finish this in time for Halloween. As you guys know, because I talk about it all the time, I live in Southeast Louisiana and Halloween is not really a cold weather holiday for us. Half the time it's hot out for Halloween. So I felt like a berry witch was probably just as fitting as any pumpkin witch, and it definitely has those South in America vibes without being like, you know, South in America vibes. But I really enjoyed drawing and inking and painting this illustration with you guys. And I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial and enjoyed hanging out with me. If you are new here and you had a good time and you want to hang out with me some more, make sure you hit that subscribe button and click the bell notification so that YouTube will let you know when I've got something new in the works. If you're one of my subscribers and you haven't been getting notifications from YouTube, do me a big favor and make sure you've got the notifications turned on, because sometimes they get turned off by accident, or sometimes settings change, or sometimes you think you turned it on and you didn't. That happened to me, so you could check that. Or you can follow me over on Twitter, because I share most, not always all, but most of the stuff that I make here over on my Twitter as well. And if you like what I do and you want to help me continue to do it, you can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup, and you will also get access to the printable line art for this, so that if you want to, you can paint or color along, or you could just treat it as a coloring page and color it however your heart desires. You can tell whatever color story you wish to tell. But hopefully I'll see you guys over on Patreon. For the materials that I used in this tutorial, make sure you check that description, because I always list them and link them out for you guys. And I will also have other helpful, useful, and informative tutorials linked down there in case you guys are in the mood for more of me or for more of my art. I hope you guys have a wonderful Halloween full of all of the spookiest costumes and the tastiest candy. And I hope to see you guys again soon. Huge thanks to my amazing patrons on Patreon. Y'all's support helps me do what I'm doing here on the channel, and it is much appreciated. Thank you guys so much.